Welcome everybody to the latest in the ongoing series of the VC's reading group. It's lovely for you all to be able to join us. I am Dr. Stephen Sparks. I'm in the history department at the University of Johannesburg. And though my own research is on the 20th century South Africa and apartheid, and in fact, science and technology, and more specifically Sasol, I really thoroughly enjoyed reading this book with our Vice Chancellor. We do in fact have somebody in our department who works on the early modern world, but he was not available today. So I was delighted to be able to step in his place. Just briefly, I'm going to introduce Professor Marwala, and then Professor Marwala will talk for a short while about his impressions of the book for this week. And then we will open for questions. I have some thoughts, and I would like to encourage you all to use the question and answer function in Zoom. That'll be at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function. So specifically, please use the question and answer function. So just briefly to introduce Professor Marwala. Professor Marwala is the author of very many books and articles, but to briefly touch on his own educational background, he has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, which is one of the top universities of its sort in the United States, a Master of Engineering and Mechanical Engineering at the University of Pretoria, and then a DPhil in Engineering from the University of Cambridge via St. John's College in Cambridge. So a very esteemed educational background. And just to select two recent books, which I'm sure many of you have a sense of, but just to give a kind of flavor of Professor Marwala's preoccupations, which I'm very interested to see brought into communication with the book for today. His most recent books include Closing the Gap, The Fourth Industrial Revolution in Africa, and Leading in the 21st Century, The Call for a New Type of African Leader. Now, in fact, that book has been out for, very recently. The book for today is called 12 Who Ruled? The Year of Terror in the French Revolution, by a historian who's now no longer with us, called R.R. Palmer. It's a kind of classic in the field of French revolutionary studies. It was first published in 1941 and has not gone out of print, which gives you a sense of how important this book has been in the field of French revolutionary studies. But now I'm going to hand over to Professor Marwala to hear his thoughts on the book.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sparks, for that introduction. I feel quite intimidated as an engineer that you, who is a historian, will be responding to the history book that I have just read. The idea of reading and the importance of a society that actually reads is something that I take very, very seriously. I would like to thank the library for facilitating my reading sessions. This has been going quite well. I also would like to thank the Chair of Council, who is with us here, who also has joined me in reading. Just this weekend, I was invited to a reading session in Namibia from the advisor to the president of Namibia, who actually told me that they were inspired. She was inspired by our reading session, that she has started her own reading session. And I don't know whether it is fortunately or unfortunately, but the first book that was read was actually my book, Leading in the 21st Century. As you also know, the president of the country has also started his own reading group. And I was privileged to be one of the first people to be invited to share a stage with the Minister of Basic Education on reading, again, a book. These sessions, I've been taking these sessions quite so seriously that I have finished a manuscript leadership lessons from the 50 books I read, which is going to be published in July this year. And former President Thabo Mbeki has written quite an inspiring foreword for that book. The 12 Who Ruled is really about the French Revolution. I discovered the French Revolution quite late. Like many people who grew up in South Africa, we would have been exposed to the Russian Revolution and to some extent to the Cuban Revolution. And of the revolutions that I have studied, I think the French Revolution, certainly the first French Revolution that saw the establishment of the first French Republic, actually is one of the most inspiring. Now, I've read quite a number of books around the French Revolution. The first one is really the person who was the big motivator for some of the principal players in the French Revolution. That was J.J. Rousseau. I read the book, The Social Contract. So in The Social Contract, J.J. Rousseau says that, you have the people and you have the government. The people give power to the government in exchange for protection from the government. And according to him, if that social contract is broken, one way of breaking it is by government not protecting the people. Corruption is one of the things that undermine the social contract, something that we are talking quite a great deal about here in South Africa that we have to confront. Then the people, according to Rousseau, have the right to overthrow the government. And of course, this was the basis that led some of the principal players in the first in the French Revolution to overthrow the monarchy. The other book that I read around the French Revolution was A Tale of Two Cities, written by a British man called Charles Dickens. Many French scholars actually say it is a tale of one city because the author only lived in one, not two cities. I think it is it's not a very good depiction of the French Revolution. And the other book that I read was The Age of Reason, written by Thomas Paine. For those of you who might not know, Thomas Paine was a British revolutionary who fought in the war for independence in the United States. And when he heard that there is another revolution in France, he quickly ran to be a full participant. He became the member of the National Assembly in France. And during the Reign of Terror, which was the architects of this Reign of Terror are the 12 who ruled. He was sentenced to be guillotined, only to be saved by unlikely events, including the fall of the leader of the 12, Maximilian Robespierre, who fell and was guillotined 3 days later. So the French Revolution is one of the most seminal events in the last 400 years. It succeeded in getting rid of the monarchy for some time. As we know, the monarchy came back in different form in France after Napoleon. It got rid of the Catholic Church, which was a dominant power in France before the French Revolution. Because it was so much against the monarchy, it gave us what in science we call the international system units. Today we measure things using meters and kilometers and centimeters. These are and kilograms. This is what is called the international system units. Before, we used to measure, distance by how long the foot of a king is. In fact, when you go to United States, they still use that English system. Feet. It was the feet of one of the British kings. So they were so anti-monarchy that they got rid of that way of measuring and introduced the international system, which is a dominant system. In fact, it's only United States, ironically, who stuck with that system of measuring. It abolished feudalism and for some time slavery. It introduced many tenets of liberal democracy that we see today. And to paraphrase the architect of the Reign of Terror and the leader of the 12 who ruled, Maximilian Robespierre, it introduced the three principles, and I quote, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Of course, many people don't know that it's actually Robespierre who came up with this liberty, equality, and fraternity. It was such a dominant, it was such an influential concept that if you look at the French flag, it has three colors: liberty, equality, and fraternity. If you look at the Italian flag, same thing. If you look at the Belgian flag, same thing. And if you look at the German flag, same thing. It actually led to a movement that changed the face of Europe. It also introduced many ideas that became the foundation of communism, the political system that at one stage ruled more than half of the world's population. And obviously, it is the dominant ideology in the People's Republic of China. 1.3 billion people live under that ideology. It gave us commonly used political terminologies, such as left and right wing. Left-wing politicians, of course, within the French, the context of the French Revolution, were the Jacobins and the Montagnards. The Jacobins, many of these people, almost 10 of these people of the 12, belonged to a faction in the National Assembly called the Jacobins. They were left-wing, they were Republicans. They did not want the monarchy. And the reason why the term left-wing came was because they usually sat on the left-hand side and they were opposed to privilege. Right-wing politicians sat on the right-hand side and advocated for royal privileges. Interestingly, many of the principal protagonists of the revolution were relatively young, averaging 32 years of age. Of course, the French Revolution actually started with the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille was a place where the French army used to store the arms. So when the French people stormed the Bastille and imprisoned King Louis the 16th, the original intention was to create a constitutional democracy where the king would be ceremonial and the National Assembly would rule the country. Louis the 16th and his family's attempt to flee the country led to his and his wife Marie Antoinette's death at the guillotine. The guillotine is that symbol of the French Revolution where the head was just cut exactly very, very quickly. The guillotine was also called the national razor, and the French revolutionaries considered it holy. You can never remove religion out of people. Even in an era where religion was on the descent, the word holy was still there. And the guillotine was ironically designed by Dr. Joseph Guillotine, and Louis XVI, the King of France. Little did he know that he was going to be guillotined himself. Fearing that the revolution will spread to their capitals after European powers attempted to invade France to restore the monarchy. This, together with internal revolts, made the Committee of Public Safety introduce what is called the Reign of Terror. The Committee of Public Safety was actually, the architect of this was a gentleman called Georges Danton, who ironically later on was guillotined, So the Committee of Public Safety was a committee of the National Convention that served as France's wartime cabinet. It initially consisted of 9 members, and between 1793 and 1794, it had 12 members. So it instituted what is known as the Reign of Terror. And the Reign of Terror turned the revolution, which had noble ideals and goals, into a killing machine that, if I were to quote one of the French philosophers, that devoured its children. The book, The 12th Rule, is about 12 members of the Committee of Public Safety who ruled France from the 5th of September 1793 to 31 July 1794. When Robespierre, who acted as the government's de facto head during this period, was deposed and guillotined with his close lieutenants, the Reign of Terror ended and the Directory took over. 5 years later, there was a coup d'etat led by Louis Bonaparte. Robespierre was a serious revolutionary who was also a bachelor and was driven by ideals. Thus, he was called the Incorruptible. 10 of the 12 members of the Committee of Public Safety were the left-wingers, the Mountaineers or Mountains, a group of radical members of the convention. The other 2 were affiliated to the Plain, another faction in the National Convention. All these factions were members of the Jacobin Club, a caucus group in the National Convention that ruled France. These 12 people included Carnot, whose descendant formulated the second law of thermodynamics and introduced concepts such as Carnot's engine's efficiency that we as mechanical engineers spent a great deal of time learning. One wonders what would have happened to science if Carnot, like many of his contemporaries, was sent to the guillotine. Carnot's other descendant included the President of France, Marie-Françoise Sadi Carnot. These 12 oversaw the Reign of Terror, which included the killing of 2,000 people in Lyon and more than 40,000 people in France. What drove the Reign of Terror? The ideas of enlightenment drove the French Revolution, as I've already indicated, especially the ideas from Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his book, of course, I've already talked about this, he justified the use of violence to achieve revolutionary aims. The revolutionary French government failed to govern because of the threat of foreign invasion and internal civil war, including wars between the clergy, nobility, and the ordinary people, making the revolutionaries, especially these 12, resort to terror. These 12 used the guillotine to instill republican values in the French people. However, because these 12 were mere mortals, other factors such as petty jealousy, political rivalry came on the way, and terror was used for settling political scores, causing many deaths. The 12 thus sent Georges Danton, a popular revolutionary, and other Dantonists to the guillotine because of factionalism. Factional battles could be deadly. Then came the law of suspect, which means you could be punished and in many instances killed because you are a suspect. In this regard, one of the 12 who ruled, Georges Punton, said that those who are afraid are guilty because those who were innocent are not afraid. So fear became a crime. The revolution had a de-Christianization project. Before the revolution, the French society was organized into 3 estates in accordance to privilege. At the top were the nobility, then came the clergy, and then the ordinary people. The Catholic Church was very wealthy and owning vast lands and property portfolio. So the aim of de-Christianization was first and foremost to appropriate the assets of the church. Churches were converted into temples of reason. One of them that was used to house the Jacobin sect of the Catholic Church became the meeting for the so-called the Jacobins faction in the National Assembly, which was the dominant political class during the Reign of Terror. Robespierre, the leader of the 12, realizing the importance of deity, introduced a cult of supreme being that replaced the cult of reason. These cults were meant to replace the Catholic Church. Science was not spared during this reign of terror. The father of modern chemistry, Antoine Lavoisier, was accused of not being revolutionary enough and was charged and sentenced to the guillotine. When his wife pleaded that he be spared because France needed scientists, the judge replied that, and I quote, "The revolution does not need scientists," close quote. In 2015, here in South Africa, at the University of Cape Town, at the height of Feast Must Fall, a student proclaimed that, and I quote, "Science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off, especially in Africa," close quote. She went on to talk about people in a municipality in KwaZulu-Natal, Mhlaba uyalingana, who create lightning and that science could not explain that. Revolutions tend to attract some of the worst personalities and tend not to attract scientists. This is because science, due to its inflexible nature, when it comes to the truth, tends to breed conservatives. The widespread presence of propaganda, where science is twisted to meet an agenda, is an antithesis to the tenet of the truth as the objective. Conservatives are by definition not revolutionaries. Of the 12 who ruled France, 8 were lawyers and 2 were engineers and none were scientists. Engineers use science to create that which does not exist, while scientists use logic to observe and discover that which already exists. What culminated in the fall of the 12 was that Robespierre went to the National Convention and said that he had uncovered another conspiracy in the convention. When members of the National Convention asked him for the names, he refused to give these names. Fearing for their lives, they plotted against Robespierre and his faction, and he was guillotined, and that was the end of the reign of terror. What leadership lessons can we gain from this book? Firstly, revolutionary change is difficult to control. From the Russian Revolution to the Chinese Revolution, revolutions leave victims by the wayside while creating a new society. Very often revolutions are hijacked by corrupt men, normally men. It has never really been many women. And I think this brings to the fore the importance of bringing women to the pinnacle of leadership in every society. And of course, it is hijacked by these corrupt men. And these corrupt men, their intentions are to increase their well-being, usually at the expense of the greater good. What we ought to do is to put mechanisms in place to safeguard society. Secondly, beware of slogans and sloganeering. In this book, we learn about the slogan, and I quote, "Terror is the order of the day," close quote. Terror did not serve its purpose of defending France. Terror did serve its purpose of defending France. But after the threat to France had disappeared, terror did not disappear. Thirdly, as Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese preeminent leader, said, and I quote, "Hide your intention, bide your time." As Deng Xiaoping said, Robespierre made his intentions known, and his enemies pounced first. Fourthly, never lose sight of the end goal. Somehow the revolutionaries were no longer sure of the end goal, which killed the French Revolution. Consequently, the French Revolution started with the king and ended up with the emperor. And that was not the goal of the revolution. And as Karl Marx, paraphrasing Engels, put it, history repeats itself, first as a tragedy, and second as a farce. Because these events that happened during the French Revolution, including the seizure of power by Napoleon, repeated themselves 40 years later, leading to the seizure of power by another Napoleon who was a nephew of the first Napoleon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marwala. That was excellent and very interesting indeed. So I'm going to provide some thoughts, but I would like to prompt people who are joining us on our webinar to send any questions they might have in the Q&A function in Zoom. So don't use the chat function, use the Q&A function, please. I just wanted to say, for a book that was written in 1941, or thereabouts, or at least published in 1941, it's a book that I think hasn't dated very badly at all. In fact, I think the first thing to say is the prose I found excellent. And in many ways, he tells the story. Palmer tells the story in a very, it's a gripping story, and he tells it very well. And I think it's also important to remember one bit of the context for when it was written. It was written by a professor based then, I think, at Princeton in the US, who was observing, like many people, the rise of the Nazis and, in fact, the start of World War II with great concern. And the book really is written in that context. And there are a couple of points where he makes analogies to what would have then been contemporary politics and the threat represented by the Nazis. So he's writing about a kind of moment in history where something with very laudable goals, which indeed did, as Professor Marwala said, give us many of the kind of key notions that are central to our understandings of democracy, something like that turned into an increasingly, you could say, certainly authoritarian. And I think at certain points, Palmer implies totalitarianism is also kind of looming as a threat. And of course, he is thinking about the Nazis. But he's not judging the Jacobins. I think one of the things that the book is particularly impressive on is its balance, because it really provides an account of the way 18th century Enlightenment thought, and especially these ideas of what we would call, and they themselves may even have called, reason, and the attempt to make society more egalitarian, less organized around hereditary power and monarchy, and also religion. That attempt is a laudable one, and we are all the beneficiaries of many aspects of that legacy. But at the same time, he doesn't excuse or apologize for the excesses. And I think that's really the strength of the book, is that it manages to kind of walk this very fine line. And obviously, in a lot of writing about the French Revolution, that is not the case. Robespierre, to this day, is a figure who's often invoked by people who are critics of more radical forms of social reform or social change and activism. He's often invoked as a kind of an example of how attempts at progressive change can go badly wrong. And there is indeed something very important in that. But I think one of the virtues of this book is that it is its psychological complexity. So it really provides a portrait of the individuals who are part of that group of 12 on what now sounds like a very Orwellian name, the Committee for Public Safety. That group of men, and we'll come back to that point as you have raised too, Professor Marwala. That group of men are provided with we get an incredibly detailed sense of their psychological makeup, and that's really excellent. They're not stereotypes, and their complexity and their positioning inside of the French Revolution is just, I think, tremendous. I have a couple of questions, perhaps, which I can always raise at some point. But I suppose one that first sprung to my mind was not really actually a question, more an observation. He's really describing a universal paradox, which is the paradox of the nation state. He's one of the points he makes is that in some ways it's hard to imagine that the terror couldn't have happened in some form, given the context in which it happened, because there was a war with European powers. France was involved in a war with European powers, had massive debt, including funding the American Revolution, incredible poverty and hunger and starvation through much of France, amongst the peasants and the urban poor. And of course, there were indeed enemies of the revolution. So Palmer is very careful to say, clearly, the 12 who ruled became paranoid and kind of obsessed with crushing what they saw as the counter-revolution, and that had incredibly tragic effects. But it was also true that there were actually people who were opposed to the changes that they had brought to France, or were trying to bring to France. And the other thing is exactly what I think Professor Marwala said, which is that we all have this paradox, which is that, we live in a country, for instance, which has a very progressive constitution. But if you put many of the kind of key aspects of that constitution, especially rights granted to, for instance, homosexual people and women and various other rights, to a kind of popular vote, they would probably be defeated. And I think that's something that the French revolutionaries were grappling with, which is that they were trying to transform a very conservative, Catholic, monarchical society almost overnight. And of course, that was probably deluded, and to think that they could do it unrealistic. And their methods can certainly be called into question, as they should be. But there is something universal about that, and I think that's very interesting and something that we can think about. So there are other things to say. I think that I'll make one more comment. I want to invite people to ask questions in the Q&A, and we are getting some. So the last thing I will say, despite having said the book dates quite well, there are ways in which it has been overtaken by developments in the historical literature since then. And in fact, much of this has happened in French history writing specifically, which is that we have the emergence of this book is written from above. It's written really from the view of the 12 who ruled, of the Committee for Public Safety, rather than from below. So social historians subsequently have tried to sort of write about this moment and others like it from below, the view from the street, if you like, or the view from the queue for bread in Paris. And so social history, and also especially women's history, have really transformed how we think about this. One thing in Palmer's favor is he does not mention women. So there is a point at which he says women bear the brunt of the social conditions that led to the revolution, and also bear the brunt of the terror. And I think he does a pretty good job of flagging that for us. But of course, that's not his focus. His focus is the 12 men who ruled. And other historians subsequently have also done a very good job of taking the texts like Paine, like Rousseau, which were circulating through France, and not just France, in England and in revolutionary America and in Haiti, which I'll come to. Historians have done a very good job of trying to track how ordinary people may have actually read those texts which were circulating at the time. So there are all sorts of ways in which this book doesn't get to other larger questions. It's addressing probably one of the biggest questions, of course, but there are other ones that it doesn't get to. The gendered notion of citizenship, for instance, at the heart of the French Revolution. He does mention women and other activists who were pushing for women to have access to the vote, for instance, this new notion of the vote, to break it open in gendered terms. But I'll leave it at that. We have, for now anyway, we have 2 questions, and I'd like to invite more. So let me start with Letlokwa Mpedi, who says, thank you, VC. I have a question. 8 out of 12 committee members were lawyers. What do you make of this interesting configuration of the committee? It is an interesting one. Professor Marwala, why don't you take that, and then we'll do the next one.
The politics of revolutions and the street are politics of the spoken word. I mean, they really are politics of the spoken word. And lawyers, more than any other profession, is a profession of the spoken word, you know. And I actually think it explains why in many Western democracies, you tend to see quite a bit of lawyers in the public space. And the reason is actually the fact that revolutions require men of great words. You know, Robespierre was obviously also a lawyer. You know, but if you look at what is happening to China now, most of the rulers are not lawyers; they are actually engineers. And one of the things that I was in a panel where a prominent businessman from Shanghai was in the panel, and he made a statement that in the Chinese political system, you can't get elected because you can give a good speech. You have to demonstrate technical capability to be able to govern and to be able to build and so on and so forth. Now, just talking about the role of women in the revolution, Stephen, that you actually raised. Of course, when if you see when they went to Versailles to basically take the royal family and bring them to Paris, I think that was the last time the royal family lost their freedom. The primacy of women could not be emphasized enough. In fact, many of these women were the women who walked in butcheries and they were able to, and the storming of the Bastille, women were actually there. One of the things that people tend to forget is that outside the reign of terror, even before the reign of terror, the idea of using terror to build republican ideals was actually always there. There used to be a man called Marat, Jean-Paul Marat, was not one of the 12, but he became a martyr for Robespierre and other people in the committee of 12. And he used to basically say, terror, I want more terror, I want more heads. That's what he used to say. And he was killed by a woman. She went there to tell him about some conspiracy and then stabbed him. So women were actually principally there. The other issue that I really wanted to put forward is the issue of religion. Because, you see, Reformation, which was the movement away from the Catholic Church, I mean, that's what Reformation is all about. It's when European powers were moving away from the clutches of the remnant of the Roman Empire, which was the Catholic Church. In Germany, it largely expressed itself through the Catholic Church. In England, it expressed itself through the English Church, but it was because the king wanted to remarry. So the English Reformation, the Puritans used to say the English Reformation was not reformed enough. But what happened in France was to move not to another form of Christianity, a light version of Christianity. They wanted to eliminate Christianity from their society. The Committee of 10 wanted to get rid of religion altogether. And in fact, Robespierre, one of the committee of 12, the leader, actually introduced the cult of supreme being. All of them were there. All the 12 were there. They went and launched this new religion. And of course, you can't see that pendulum against what happened before the French Revolution, which was a very fundamental aspect of Roman Catholicism, which led to the expulsion of the what are called the Huguenots, and many of them actually came to South Africa. That is why amongst the Afrikaners, you have French last names such as Leroux, de Klerk, Malam, Dutoy, and so on and so forth. They were running away from that persecution of a different sect of Christianity by the Catholic Church. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chancellor. So I have two more questions in the chat, in the Q&A specifically, and I have one myself. But I think I just want to encourage more people to put questions. Karen Jennings, who is in fact a postgrad in the history department, like quite a few of our attendees today. Within the 12, there were factions, paranoia, power struggles, all at the cost of the masses. This seems very similar to what we see in politics today, not only within South Africa. Do you have any thoughts on how the lessons that you mentioned from this revolution can translate to current day politics? Keep in mind, historians are always a little nervous about straight lines.
Well, I mean, there are many people who believe that unfactionalized politics is good. I actually don't think so. I think factions are okay. I think factions are an expression of democratic ideals. So we should not be afraid of factions. If you come here within the ruling party in South Africa, the ANC, there are different factions that they are fighting. Factions become problematic if the fight is about self-interest. When, and self-interest manifests itself in the form of corruption and so on and so forth, then it becomes dangerous. If you look at the other revolution, I'll go to the Russian Revolution. When before Lenin came, before they won, there used to be Menshevik and Bolsheviks. Those were two different factions. One was eliminated, and then the Bolsheviks won power. And once they were in power, and even before Lenin died, there was two factions. One led by Joseph Stalin, that gentleman from Georgia, and another one led by Trotsky. Again, Stalin basically decimated the other faction. Literally, he killed them. He killed them out of existence. He followed, Trotsky in Mexico and killed, and he was killed with an ice pick. So factions are actually part of the political process. What we ought to guard against is these factions tending to violence. And especially here in South Africa, we tend to say, but no, we don't have the sort of violence that we saw happening in China during the Chinese Cultural Revolution. We don't have the violence that we saw during the worst times of the reign of terror of Stalinism in the 1930s. But it happens at a different scale. We know of political players who were assassinated and so on and so forth. So the lesson is that we need to put into place mechanisms to deal with issues of violent factionalism and self-interested factionalism that comes at the expense of society.
Thank you, Professor Marwala. I mean, I think there are lots of resonances globally in some of the language of that committee. If you think of the way that especially foreign conspiracy is invoked, and certainly also the notion of traitors, absolutely central. So there's another question which is actually specifically in some ways about engineering, which you have also invoked, Professor Marwala. It's unfortunately the person is listed as anonymous. How can you motivate, Prof? How do you motivate engineering students to start reading these kinds of books for social science awareness? That's what this person puts in parenthesis. Because I think as engineers, we are more inclined to numbers rather than words and theory.
I think exactly what we are doing now is one of the strategies that we need to embark on to encourage certainly people from the technical area to start reading books like this. I think that's one. The second one is actually to put it into our curriculum. I was an undergraduate student in North America, and it was not negotiable that I take 12 semesters of human and social sciences. I mean, that was quite extraordinary when I think about it, and now I can see the advantages of this. I was talking to the German ambassador. I say, the reason why Germany does not have its own version of Facebook or Twitter or those kind of technologies that are very multidisciplinary is because German education is not multidisciplinary enough. And by extension, you can say the same about the British educational system. We need to introduce it into our curriculum. It can't be left to for people to volunteer to take these classes. It has to be embedded. And the reason is very, very simple. Engineers are designing things that actually have relations with society, with people, with culture, and so on and so forth. For example, when an engineer designs an automated translator, whether it is Google Translate, whether it is Siri. By definition, that device has relations to language, and by extension to culture, and by extension to people. So the person who designs that engineering system, if that person does not have sufficient understanding of all those factors, people, culture, language, then ultimately that engineer is not going to design good products. So it is very, very important. Now we are having AI systems that are writing essays. There is a paper, by the way, that was completely written by an AI algorithm. It's a book that was written completely by an AI algorithm, published by Springer. Now, can it sufficiently do that unless the engineer who designed it has a sufficient understanding of human beings, their aspirations, and so on and so forth? Very, very important. So it has to happen. We have to create social infrastructure, reading clubs everywhere to encourage people who are from the technical subject to read. In fact, to encourage everybody, because reading has to become part of our culture, and reading widely has to become part of our culture, but also it has to be embedded in our curriculum. That is why now you have AI, introductory AI course. That's why we have Africa Insights modules. That's not enough. That's not nearly enough. We need to expand that.
Yes, I agree, Vice Chancellor. In fact, as it happens, my department, the history department, does actually teach a service course to engineers at UJ, which is not actually the kind of course that I think we are all talking about. It's a kind of leftover from, it's sort of heritage impact assessment is basically what is the skill set that engineers are taught, which is effectively, I mean, not to do it violence, but I think the course is about reminding engineers and showing them how to do a heritage impact assessment before they tear down a building. And that's important, but it's too narrow. And I know that our department would certainly support a much more serious, thoroughgoing sort of meeting of engineering or the sciences more broadly with the social sciences. In fact, I don't see any other questions. So maybe let me see if I can ask this question, because it is on this topic. There's one reading of Palmer's book is as a cautionary tale, in part, not in a moralistic way, because it's actually very non-judgmental, I think. But there is a way in which it's really a critique of some of the hazards of reason when reason tips over into irrationality, where the pursuit of reason becomes the goal in and of itself, if you like. And of course, there's a very large literature by this point. Some of it is glossed accurately, sometimes less accurately, as postmodern critique of modernism and of reason. Which I actually don't necessarily agree with. I'm a big advocate of progressive reform in general. And I do think that in many ways what we see in this country of ours is certainly we have seen some of the ways in which modernist interventions and plans have done damage. But if anything, we've had too little science, too little progressive reform that's informed by expertise in our history and in our present. So I think we're on the same page. But there is a way in which this book does nonetheless, Vice Chancellor, include quite a lot of material that would suggest that social engineers really do need to be careful in the formulation of their plans and the implementation of their plans. And so I suppose I'm asking a professor of engineering to reflect on that. And actually, I have a very good book recommendation, which you might like to take up, by James C. Scott. It's called Seeing Like a State. And the subtitle is how plans for the improvement of the human condition have failed, or something like that. And I think you'd find it very interesting because similarly, it's about social engineering across the 20th century, and it looks at Russia, it looks at Tanzania, it looks at other places I'm forgetting. It's not a perfect book, but I think you might find it interesting. So just perhaps to close, unless we do have one more question.
Look, the idea of social engineering has obviously been given a bad name by people such as Adolf Hitler, rightfully so, and also by Stalin, and many other, even Mao, but societies have been engineered from time immemorial. So I lived in the United States and I lived in Europe. When I was in Europe, I will go and to a pub with group of friends and we'll drink a little bit too much. The British people will never want to drive after that. None of them. They will never want to drive. And I used to ask myself, we know how disorganized Europe was 400-500 years ago. It was a very disorganized place, dirty, people not bathing for weeks and so on and so forth. But how did we have a transformation of a people from that state to what we see today? It was social engineering. What were some of the elements of the social engineering? They will you will do small crime, petty crimes, and then they will decide that you are going to be hanged. For those of you who read Charles Dickens' Oliver Twist, you still remember the expression, "That boy shall be hanged," close quote. And then they will parade this poor guy, Oxford Street, and somewhere along the road, people are watching, and somewhere along the road, they will give him his last beer. That was the birth of the term, one for the road, and we'll go to Trafalgar Square, and that person will be publicly hanged. What do you think it does to society? It engineers a society that is afraid of authority. And that is what you have in Europe today. It was engineered through violence. Let's look at Japan. The samurai were not in Japan. Everybody complies. The samurais no longer exist today, but everybody complies. If there are pictures of feet in a train station, people are going to step on those. Because of this samurai culture where you had people walking around with swords and they could kill, they had license to kill. You know what? Who was engineered? A population of people who are afraid of authority. And we know what is happening to China now. Again, China is becoming very, it's one country that is just becoming developed so quickly. You can see order, That order is not, So now the question that we have to ask ourselves, because there is a need to socially engineer South Africa. You just have to go around and see littering on the street. How do we engineer a society that does not lead on the street? It shouldn't be through violence, obviously. Should it be through education? What should we do? It is clear, we have problems of work ethic that will go to some of our public spaces, and you will see people talking about soccer instead of attending to you. How do we engineer a culture of service? It can't be done through violence, but we have. Does it mean that we have to emphasize it at school? Make sure that at the earliest form of school, we tell people you have to be cleaning your yard. You have to be cleaning outside. In Rwanda, everybody once a month is supposed to go outside and clean. And that is why Kigali is one of the cleanest cities in the world. So I guess what I'm saying is that violence as a form of social engineering is bad. But creating incentives for people to act in a way that is beneficial to everybody, to the greatest number of people, is actually good. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Marwala. Some more questions coming up. So this is actually Dr. Nafisa Isop Sheikh, also from the History Department, who's also in the session. She says, the social contract inherent in the post-revolutionary state given to democratic rulers by the consent of the governed is undergirded by taxation. In SA, only 5.8% of our population is paying 92% of all personal tax, and about 85% of VAT. That's according to MoneyWeb in March 2021. She's a historian, she knows how to cite. How sustainable is building or maintaining a social contract in this situation? So it's really about the social contract in South Africa today.
Absolutely not sustainable at all. So that is why it is absolutely important for the right of work. Now, the right of work became a big deal during the Second Republic, events leading to the Second Republic. The right of work is very, very important because it contributes towards building the social contract. The fact that only 5 out of 6 million people actually have jobs that require them to pay tax is absolutely not sustainable, and we need to change it by creating a dynamic economy that creates jobs, decreases unemployment and inequality and poverty, and that will strengthen social contract.
Well, I think you've given us, and this book has given us a lot to think about, Professor Marwala. One of the things I liked, one of many things I liked about Palmer's argument is that he emphasized at a number of points the distinction between intent and effect. And I think that's clear in the book, that in fact, Catholicism is still an important force in France today. Obviously, it's not the Catholicism of the 18th century, but nonetheless, the process of change and planning in relation to change is a very complicated one. And I think, and I don't see any other questions, so I think we may well be able to leave it here. Do you have any closing remarks, Vice Chancellor?
No, thank you very much. I am absolutely delighted that you have actually come to read this book with me, and I invite you to come and read another book next month, The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. Hopefully you're going to come and let us engage on that. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us.
The University of Johannesburg. The future reimagined.